Picture the scene the way every movie, every podcast, every late-night Wikipedia rabbit hole has trained you to see it. A stone castle in the Carpathian Mountains. Winter. Candles throwing long shadows on the walls. A woman in a dark dress walks down a spiral staircase into a cellar, and the cellar is full of girls. Young girls, noble girls, sent to her estate by their own families to learn manners and needlework and Latin. Girls who believed they had been handed a future. Instead, the story goes, they were handed to her. She tortures them. She bites them. She drains their blood into a copper tub, and she lowers herself in, because she has convinced herself, at 40, at 50, that the blood of virgins will keep her young. 650 of them, by the time anyone stops her. Some say more. The Countess who bathed in blood, the Blood Countess, Countess Dracula, the most prolific female murderer in recorded history. That is the Elizabeth Bathory the world knows. That is the Elizabeth Bathory who shows up in horror films, in heavy metal lyrics, in the back of every listicle titled History's Most Evil Women. That is the woman Bram Stoker is rumored to have studied before he sat down to write Dracula. She is a synonym. Say her name, and most people, in most countries, can give you the shape of the story. The bathtub, the blood, the 600 girls. Here is what almost none of them can give you. A date she was tried, a verdict that was read against her, a sentence that was handed down, the name of the judge, the courtroom, the day she was executed, because there isn't one. There is no date she was tried. There is no verdict. There was no judge, no public trial, no sentence, no execution. She was never cross-examined. She was never allowed to face the 300 witnesses who spoke against her. She was never given a chance to answer the most famous accusation ever leveled at a woman in European history, the accusation that turned her into a monster, that filled 1,000 books and 100 films, that put her name next to Dracula's on bookstore shelves. That accusation was never tested in any court. Not once. And the blood, the thing she is most famous for, the bathtub, the 650 girls, the reason every retelling of her story exists. Not a single one of the more than 300 witnesses who testified against her in the year 1611 ever mentioned it. Not one, not a drop, not a tub, not a single girl killed for her blood, not a single word about bathing in it, not a single word about staying young. The most famous detail of the most famous female murderer in history appears nowhere in the record of her own case. It appears for the first time, in print, 115 years after she died, in a book written by a Jesuit priest who never met her, never visited her castle, and never read the trial transcript, because the trial transcript had not been published yet. Think about that for a moment. The single most famous thing about her, the thing you already knew, the thing I assumed you knew, the thing the algorithm assumes you clicked to hear, was invented, from nothing, a full century after she was dead. And once you know that, the entire story has to be re-examined. Every detail, every name, every motive. Tonight, that is exactly what we are going to do. We are not going to retell the legend. You have heard the legend. We are going to do something the legend has never allowed anyone to do for very long. We are going to read the actual record, the letters, the witness statements, the private correspondence of the men who came for her, the diary of the investigator, the agreement, signed by her own son-in-law, to divide up her property, signed 2 weeks before anyone arrested her. We are going to follow the calendar, day by day, the way the channel has done before, and we are going to let the dates speak for themselves. Because the dates, unlike the legend, do not lie. And what the dates will show you is this. The woman who was never tried was the most powerful woman in Central Europe. She read 4 languages. She ran a fortune. She ran a school for girls. She corresponded with kings. She owned castles that could change the outcome of a war between empires. And the man who ordered her arrest owed her late husband a debt so large that, the moment she was taken, the debt simply disappeared, cancelled, as if it had never existed. The woman who was never sentenced had a nephew who was threatening to take the Hungarian throne away from the king who ordered her arrest. She had a cousin the same king had already tried to have killed. She had a family, in other words, that the king had every reason to want broken. And she had land, more land than the king could comfortably allow any one subject to hold. The woman who was never executed was walled into her own castle for 4 years, until she died one August night in 1614, complaining only that her hands were cold. And then, over the next century, the legend grew. The bathtub, the blood, the 600 girls, a story so useful, so profitable, so convenient to so many powerful men that nobody bothered to ask where it had come from, until, finally, somebody did, and the answer turned out to be nowhere. This is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, not the Blood Countess, the other one, the one the legend was built to bury. By the end of tonight, you will know which parts of the famous story are true. There are some. You will know which parts are lies. There are more of those, and you will know, precisely, who profited from turning a woman into a monster, and why, 400 years later, the monster is still more useful to most people than the truth. We start where she started, not in a cellar, not in a bathtub, in a family that, for 100 years, had been one of the most powerful on the continent. A family that produced a king of Poland, a family that ran half of Hungary, a family that, by the time Elizabeth was born into it, in the summer of 1560, had made enemies of exactly the wrong people. We start with the woman herself, before the legend, before the walls. She was born on the 7th of August, 1560, on a family estate at near Báthory, in the eastern reaches of the Kingdom of Hungary. They named her Báthory Erzsébet. We know her as Elizabeth Bathory. And the first thing to understand about her, the thing the legend leaves out entirely, is that she was not born into a cellar. She was born into one of the most powerful families in Europe. The Báthorys were not provincial gentry. They were not a minor noble house struggling to be noticed. They were, in the 16th century, one of the half-dozen most important dynasties in Central Europe. They had produced voivodes of Transylvania, palatines of Hungary, bishops, generals, and, in Elizabeth's lifetime, they produced a king. Her mother's brother was Stephen Báthory. In 1576, when Elizabeth was 16, Stephen Báthory was elected King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, one of the largest realms in Christendom. He would rule it, brilliantly, for a decade. So when Elizabeth was a girl, growing up at Ecsed Castle, the man she called uncle was a king. Her older brother, Stephen, would serve as Judge Royal of Hungary, one of the highest offices in the kingdom. Her cousins would rule Transylvania. To be a Báthory, in 1560, was to be born near the top of a ladder that very few families in Europe could even see the top of. Her father was Baron George V. Báthory, of the Ecsed branch of the family. Her mother was Baroness Anna Báthory of Somlyo, from the other great branch of the same house. The two branches had, over generations, intermarried with most of the notable houses of Central Europe, the Radziwiłłs of Poland-Lithuania, the Piasta Dukes of Masovia, the ruling families of Transylvania. Elizabeth's paternal great-grandmother was Anna Radziwiłł, a woman of one of the most powerful dynasties in the East. The blood in Elizabeth's veins was, by the standards of her time, some of the bluest on the continent. Both of her parents would be dead by the time she was 10. Her father died in 1570. Her mother, Anna, died the same year, at the age of 33. Elizabeth was raised, as was common for noble orphans of her station, by relatives and by governesses on the family estates. She spent her childhood at Ecsed Castle, in the flatlands of eastern Hungary, a fortress the Báthorys had held for generations. And here is a detail that matters more than it might seem. She was educated, seriously educated. Not the thin literacy of a girl taught to read her prayer book and sign her name, but the full humanist curriculum that the Báthorys, like many of the great Protestant houses of the age, considered a point of family honor. She learned Latin, the language of diplomacy, of law, of the church. She learned German, the language of the Habsburg court to the west, and of the great trading cities. She learned Greek, and of course she learned Hungarian, her own tongue, the language of the estates she would one day manage. 4 languages, in an age when most European women, even noble women, could not write a clean sentence in one. Elizabeth Bathory could read correspondence from a Polish king, a German emperor, and an Italian merchant, in their own languages, and answer them. She kept her own accounts. She signed her own letters. She ran, in writing, an estate the size of a small country. This is not a detail of a murderer. This is a detail of a ruler. And it will matter, later, that the woman the legend would reduce to a bloodthirsty maniac was, in fact, one of the most literate women of her generation. She was raised a Calvinist Protestant. This, too, matters more than it seems. The Báthorys had thrown in with the Reformation early, as many of the great Hungarian magnate families had, and their Protestantism was a point of identity, of politics, of resistance. The Habsburgs, who ruled, or claimed to rule, much of Hungary from Vienna, were Catholic, and were, throughout Elizabeth's lifetime, engaged in a long, patient project of pulling their domains back toward Rome. To be a Calvinist Báthory sitting on vast estates in Hungary was to sit on a fault line. Theology in the 16th century was never just theology. It was power. It was loyalty. It was, often enough, a reason to want a particular family broken. There is one more thing about the young Elizabeth that the records preserve, and it is uncomfortable, and we should not look away from it. Because looking away from uncomfortable details is exactly how the legend grew in the first place. As a child, she had seizures, repeated seizures. Modern readers will recognize the likely description of epilepsy, which in her century was called the falling sickness, and the treatments of the age for the falling sickness were, by our standards, monstrous. Physicians recommended rubbing the blood of a healthy person on the lips of the sufferer during an attack, or giving the sufferer a mixture of blood and a fragment of human skull as the episode ended. Read that again. The standard medical treatment for her childhood illness, prescribed by the doctors of her time, involved the blood of another person. This is not a footnote. This is a seed. The legend that Elizabeth Bathory bathed in blood to cure herself, to stay young, to feed some monstrous appetite, did not appear from nowhere. It grew, very likely, from the soil of an actual medical practice of her time, a practice she may well have been subjected to as a sick child. A fact, distorted by a century of rumor, becomes a legend. We will watch this happen, in this story, more than once. Hold on to the pattern. Fact, then distortion, then legend, then certainty. It is the engine of everything that follows. She was betrothed young. The great families of the age married their children off early, as political instruments, and Elizabeth was no exception. By the time she was 9 or 10, negotiations were underway to marry her to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, the son and heir of one of the other great magnate houses of Hungary. The Nadasdys were wealthy, military, and well-connected. The match would join two of the most powerful families in the kingdom. It was arranged, in the cold arithmetic of dynastic politics, by Ferenc's mother, Orsolya Kanizai, herself a formidable woman who managed the Nadasdy estates and who, among other things, had been made steward of Cachtice Castle by the Emperor Maximilian II in 1569. The wedding took place on the 8th of May, 1575, at the Palace of Varano, in what is now Slovakia. Elizabeth was 14 years old. She would turn 15 that August. Ferenc was 19. He had been born on the 6th of October, 1555, into a family that expected its sons to fight. And fight he did. Ferenc Nadasdy would become one of the most feared soldiers of his age. The Ottomans, against whom Hungary had been fighting for 100 years, and would fight for 100 more, gave him a name of their own. They called him the Black Bey. His own people called him the Black Knight of Hungary. He spent almost the entire long Turkish War, which ran from 1591 to 1606, in the saddle, leading raids deep into Ottoman territory, taking and retaking fortresses, and, by the accounts of his enemies, executing prisoners in ways that even his own century found severe. In 1587, he led a daring winter raid across the frozen surface of Lake Balaton, striking Ottoman positions in a season when no army was supposed to move. In 1595, he played a key role in the siege of Esztergom, one of the great Christian victories of the war. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man a great house wanted as its heir, and he was almost never home. This is the central, unavoidable fact of Elizabeth's marriage. For 29 years, she was married to a man who was, for most of those years, at war. The estate, the children, the correspondence, the tenants, the legal disputes, the harvests, the schools, the castles, all of it fell to her. While the Black Knight rode against the Turks, the Black Knight's wife ran an empire of land. And what land it was! As a wedding gift, Ferenc had settled on her the household of Cachtice Castle, in the Little Carpathians, near the town of Vágujhely, in present-day Slovakia. The castle had belonged, technically, to the Emperor Maximilian, but Ferenc's mother had held the stewardship of it since 1569, and Ferenc himself would finally buy it outright from the Emperor Rudolf II in 1602. Around Cachtice stretched a country house and 17 villages, and Cachtice was only one of the castles. There was Sarvar to the west, there was Kerestur, there was Eched, her childhood home. There were estates in Transylvania, in the heart of the Báthory heartland. The combined Nadasdy Bathory holdings, after the marriage, were among the largest private landholdings in the Kingdom of Hungary. Elizabeth ran all of it. She ran it in writing, in 4 languages, while her husband was at the front. She managed the finances. She managed the lawsuits, and there were many, because great estates in a war zone generate endless disputes over borders, rents, and rights. She managed the household, which meant, in the 16th century, managing a small town of servants, cooks, grooms, scribes, confessors, and attendants. She managed the raising of her children, 5 of whom survived infancy: Anna, born in 1585, Orsica, born around 1590, Catiline, born around 1594, Andras, born in 1596 and dead at 7, and Paul, born in 1598, who would inherit the bulk of the estate and, in time, his mother's trouble. And she managed something else, something the legend would later twist into the central horror of her story. She ran a gynaeceum. A gynaeceum, in the usage of the Hungarian nobility of the 16th century, was a household school for girls. The daughters of the lesser nobility and of the gentry were sent to great houses to be raised, to learn manners, household management, reading, needlework, sometimes Latin, sometimes music. It was, in its way, the closest thing the age had to a secondary education for women, and it was understood as an honor for the family whose daughter was accepted. The girls were fed, clothed, housed, and, in theory, launched into advantageous marriages by the mistress of the house. For a great noblewoman, running a gynaeceum was a mark of prestige. It meant your house was important enough that other families trusted you with their daughters. Elizabeth ran one. At Cachtice, at Sarvar, at her other estates, there were, at any given time, a dozen or more young noblewomen in her household, learning what young noblewomen learned, under her supervision. These girls, and the servant women who attended them, and the peasant girls who were hired on for the heaviest work, would, in time, become the center of the accusation against her. Every name in the trial record, with almost no exception, would be a female name. A woman, accused of killing women, in a household run entirely by women. Hold on to that. The gender of the dead matters. It is not an accident. So, by the time she was 30, by the time the 1590s were grinding into the new century, Elizabeth Bathory was, by any honest measure, one of the most formidable women in Europe. She was literate in 4 languages. She ran a fortune. She ran a school. She corresponded with kings and generals. She had borne 5 children. She had held together, for 2 decades, one of the greatest estates in the kingdom, while her husband was almost continuously at war. She was a Báthory, which meant her uncle had been a king, and her brother was a judge royal, and her cousins ruled Transylvania. She was a Calvinist, which meant she stood on the wrong side of the emperor's faith, and she was rich, which meant she stood on the wrong side of the emperor's treasury. The legend will tell you she was a monster hiding in a cellar. The record tells you she was a woman standing at the center of a web of money, land, theology, and war, with 3 empires, Habsburg, Ottoman, and Transylvanian, pulling at the strands around her. To understand what happened to her, you have to understand the web, because the web, not the cellar, is where the danger was. Before we follow the calendar into the year 1610, we need to stand back. We need to understand the country Elizabeth Bathory lived in, because the country she lived in is the country that killed her. Not a cellar, not a bathtub, a country. Hungary, in the year 1600, was not a nation in the modern sense. It was a wound. For 150 years, it had been the front line between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, the Hungarians had been annihilated by the army of Suleiman the Magnificent, and their young king, Louis II, had been killed, drowned in a swollen creek as he fled the field. After Mohacs, Hungary was carved into 3. The central plain, including Buda, fell under direct Ottoman rule. The east, Transylvania, became an Ottoman tributary principality, semi-independent, ruled by Hungarian princes who paid tribute to the Sultan and played a long, careful game of survival between Istanbul and Vienna. The West and the North, including most of Elizabeth's estates, fell to the Habsburgs, who claimed the Hungarian crown and ruled from Vienna. 3 Hungaries, one of them Ottoman, one of them Ottoman-backed, one of them Habsburg, and all 3 of them, for the entire span of Elizabeth's life, at war. The war she lived through was the Long Turkish War, which ran from 1591 to 1606. 15 years. Her husband fought in it from beginning to end. It was a war of raids and sieges, of border fortresses taken and retaken, of atrocities on both sides, of whole districts laid waste. The region around her own castles, the Little Carpathians, the valleys of the Vag, was a marchland. Armies moved through it. Refugees moved through it. Bandits moved through it. Tax collectors moved through it, when they dared. A great estate in such a region was not a country house in the English sense. It was a small military administrative state, expected to feed its tenants, defend its walls, answer the king's summons with cavalry, and absorb the chaos of a frontier. Into this wound, 2 other forces were pressing. The first was religion. The Reformation had come to Hungary early, and had come deep. Most of the great magnate families, the Báthorys among them, had gone Protestant, some Lutheran, many, like Elizabeth, Calvinist. The Habsburgs, who ruled from Vienna, were Catholic, and the Counter-Reformation was official Habsburg policy. The emperor's ministers wanted, slowly and patiently, to bring Hungary back to Rome. That meant, in practice, clipping the wings of the Protestant magnates. Theology and power, again, were the same thing. A Calvinist noblewoman sitting on a vast estate in the marchlands was, by her mere existence, a problem the emperor's counselors would, sooner or later, want to solve. The second force was dynastic. The Báthorys were not merely rich. They were politically dangerous. They had provided a king of Poland. They ruled Transylvania. And, in Elizabeth's own lifetime, they were making a serious bid for the throne of Hungary itself. This is the part the legend never mentions. The legend makes Elizabeth Bathory a solitary monster in a remote castle. The record makes her the aunt, cousin, and sister-in-law of men who were openly contesting the Habsburg claim to the Hungarian crown. Her nephew was Prince Gábor Báthory, Gabriel Báthory, who ruled Transylvania from 1608. Gábor was young, ambitious, and reckless. He wanted the throne of Hungary, the throne the Habsburgs held, and he said so. He was, in the language of diplomacy, a direct threat to King Matthias II, the Habsburg ruler in Vienna. Worse, from Vienna's point of view, Gábor's Transylvania was an Ottoman-backed state. A Báthory on the Hungarian throne meant, potentially, an Ottoman-aligned Hungary. And an Ottoman-aligned Hungary meant the Habsburgs would lose the entire front line against the Turks. This was, for Vienna, an existential question. Not a question of one woman, a question of empire. And Elizabeth sat right in the middle of it. Her estates, Cachtice, Sarvar, Kerestur, and the rest, straddled the routes between Habsburg Hungary and Transylvania. Her fortresses, in the hands of a friendly Transylvanian army, could open the marchlands to an invasion. Her wealth could fund one. Her name could legitimize one. She was, whether she wanted to be or not, a piece on the board. A piece the Habsburgs could not afford to leave in place if the Báthorys of Transylvania made their move. There is one more thread in this web, and it is the ugliest one, and we will come back to it again and again. King Matthias II owed her money, not a small amount, a large amount. The Habsburg treasury, perpetually drained by the war, had run up large debts to the magnates who financed the fighting on the frontier. Foremost among those magnates was the Nadezhdy family. Ferenc Nadezhdy, the Black Knight, had spent 15 years fighting the emperor's war, largely at his own expense, and the emperor's accountants had kept careful, running records of what they owed him. By the time Ferenc died, in 1604, the crown's debt to his estate was enormous, and the estate was now Elizabeth's. The debt was now owed to her. Remember this. Hold it in the front of your mind, because the record will not let you forget it. A king who owes a subject a fortune is a king with a motive, and a subject the king can discredit is a debt the king no longer has to pay. So the country Elizabeth Bathory lived in the first decade of the 17th century, was a country arranged to destroy her. She was Protestant in a Catholic-ruled realm. She was Báthory in a Habsburg Hungary. She was rich in a kingdom whose treasury was empty. She was the aunt of a prince who threatened the king's throne. She was the creditor of a king who could not pay. Any one of these alone might have been survivable. Together, they were a sentence. They just had not been read yet. Now, one final piece of context, and this one is going to sound like a digression, and it is also the most important digression in this entire story. We need to talk about how justice actually worked on a great Hungarian estate, because the entire case against Elizabeth Bathory turns on it, and the legend has trained you to misunderstand it completely. When the legend describes girls being brought to Elizabeth's castle, it describes them as victims being delivered to a killer. The record describes something different. The record describes a system in which the mistress of a great estate was, by law and by custom, responsible for the welfare of every person on that estate. That included the peasant girls hired as servants. That included the noble girls sent to the gyneceum. And it included the sick. Landowners in 16th century Hungary were responsible for the medical care of their tenants. There were no public hospitals. There were no county infirmaries. There was the Lord's castle, and the Lord's wife, and the women she kept on staff to tend the sick. A peasant woman who fell ill on a Báthory estate was brought to the castle. A servant girl who was injured was treated in the castle. A pregnant tenant was housed in the castle. The castle, among its many other functions, was the hospital of the district, and the female patients, by custom, were the responsibility of the female head of the household, Elizabeth. This is not a defense. This is a fact of the record, and it is a fact that the legend and the prosecutors and 3 centuries of retellers have quietly buried. Because once you know it, the most damning detail of the entire case against her, the detail that, more than any other, convinced her contemporaries and has convinced every reteller since, stops looking like proof of murder and starts looking like something much more complicated. The detail is this. When the investigators arrived at Cachtice in December of 1610, they found sick girls in the castle. They found injured girls. They found, according to the investigators' own letter, 1 dead girl and 1 living girl who had been, in his word, preyed upon. And this, the legend says, is the smoking gun. Caught in the act. Bodies in the cellar. What more proof could anyone need? But the record says the sick and the injured and the dying were always in the castle. They were always there. They were there because the castle was the hospital, and Elizabeth was the head of the hospital, and the women of the district came to her when they were hurt or sick or dying, because there was nowhere else to go. A dead girl in a castle that functions as a hospital is not, by itself, evidence of murder. A dead girl in a castle that functions as a hospital might be evidence of disease, of injury, of a complicated childbirth, of an infected wound, of the ordinary, relentless mortality of the early 17th century. It might also be evidence of murder. The point is that the legend has spent 400 years insisting it can only be the latter, when the record, read honestly, allows for both. We will come back to this. We will come back to it when we stand in the cellar with the investigator and look at what he actually wrote, and what he actually did not write, and what he chose, very carefully, not to ask the one living witness who could have told him the truth. But first, the man who made that choice has to enter the story, the investigator, the king's man, the husband's friend, the woman's destroyer. His name was Gheorghe Thurzo, and he is the second most important person in this entire affair. To understand what he did, and why, and what it cost, we need to understand who he was, and what he stood to gain, and the extraordinary thing her own husband did, on his deathbed, that put him within reach of her. We need to talk about the Black Knight's last days, and the friend he trusted with his widow. Ferenc Nadasti had been dying for 3 years. The illness had begun in 1601, in his legs, and it had never left him. By 1603, he was permanently disabled, unable to ride, unable to campaign, confined to his houses, while the war he had fought for a decade ground on without him. He was 48 years old. He had been a soldier since his teens. He had been the terror of the Ottoman frontier. And now he could not walk. He died on the 4th of January, 1604. He had been married to Elizabeth for 29 years. They had not, by most accounts, been a close couple in the romantic sense. Great dynastic matches rarely were. But they had been an effective partnership. He at the front, she at the estate, each running a half of the same enormous enterprise. 5 children had come of it. The eldest, Anna, was already married into the Zrinski family, one of the great Croatian-Hungarian houses. The youngest, Paul, was 6 years old and would inherit the bulk of the Nadasti fortune. The estate, the castles, the debt owed by the crown, the Gynoecium, the 17 villages around Cachtice, the Transylvanian holdings, all of it now passed, in effect, to Elizabeth, as regent for her son and as widow in her own right. She was 43 years old. She was, suddenly, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the kingdom, and she was alone. There is a detail from Nadasti's deathbed that the legend never mentions, and that the record preserves, and that you should sit with for a moment, because it is the kind of detail that, once you know it, makes everything that follows feel like a knife being slowly turned. Before he died, Ferenc Nadasti formally entrusted his heirs and his widow to the protection of a particular man, a friend, a man he trusted, a man he had worked with for years, a man who was, by office, the second highest figure in the Kingdom of Hungary, the Palatine, the king's deputy, the man who stood between the crown and the great nobles and kept the peace between them. His name was Gheorghe Thurzo, Count Gheorghe Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, and Nadasti, on his deathbed, asked him to look after his wife. Thurzo would, within 6 years, ride to that wife's castle, arrest her without a warrant, wall her up in her own rooms, seize her estate, and stand by while the king's debt to her late husband was quietly cancelled from the books. He would do this to the woman his dying friend had placed in his hands, and he would do it, the record suggests, without losing a night's sleep. Who was Gheorghe Thurzo? He was, on paper, an odd choice of persecutor for a Protestant Báthory, because he was himself a Lutheran. The legend has sometimes cast the case as a Catholic Habsburg plot against a Protestant heroine, and there is something to that, but it is not the whole story, because the man who actually led the investigation was not a Catholic. He was a co-religionist, and that, if anything, makes what he did worse, not better. Thurzo was a politician, in the fullest, oldest sense of the word. He had risen to the Palatinate by being useful to the right people, and the right people, in his case, were the Habsburgs. He was King Matthias's man. His power, his office, his lands, his son's future, all of it depended on his standing in Vienna. And Vienna, as we have already seen, had a Báthory problem. He had, by 1610, a long and well-documented history of working against exactly the branch of the Báthory family that Elizabeth belonged to. He had been involved, directly, in an attempt to assassinate her cousin, Prince Gábor Báthory of Transylvania, the same Gábor who was threatening to take the Hungarian throne from Matthias. The attempt had failed, but the intent was clear. Thurzo wanted the Báthorys of Transylvania broken, because a broken Transylvania meant a Habsburg Hungary, and a Habsburg Hungary meant a secure Vienna, and a secure Vienna meant a secure Thurzo. And he had a private ambition that the Báthorys stood directly in the way of. Thurzo wanted his own son to be elected Prince of Transylvania. The throne of Transylvania was, in this period, elective, contested among the great magnate families, and the leading Báthory candidate, the man the Báthory interest would back, was Elizabeth's own son, Paul Nadasdy. So Thurzo's son and Elizabeth's son were rivals for the same principality. The destruction of the Báthory Nadasdy interest in Hungary was, for Thurzo, not a matter of state policy alone. It was a family matter. It was personal. So here is the portrait of the man Nadasdy trusted with his widow. A Lutheran, like her, which meant he could not be dismissed as a Catholic persecutor. A Palatine, which meant he had the king's full authority. A Habsburg loyalist, which meant he had the king's full backing. A man who had already tried to have her cousin killed. A man whose own son was competing with her own son for a throne. And a man to whom the king owed, through her late husband, a sum of money so large that the crown could not pay it, and could not afford to admit it, could not pay it. This is the man who would investigate her. This is the man who would decide what evidence to collect, what witnesses to call, what questions to ask, what questions not to ask, what to put in the record, and what to leave out. The judge, the prosecutor, the investigator, and the beneficiary were, in the case of Elizabeth Bathory, the same person, and the man who should have stopped him, the king, was the man who had the most to gain from what he would find. But Thurzo was patient. He did not move in 1604, when Nadasdy died. He did not move in 1605, or 1606, or 1607. He waited. He waited because a case built solely on political motive would not survive the scrutiny of the Hungarian nobility, who were jealous of their privileges and who would rally to a fellow magnate, even a Báthory, if the crown moved against one of their number too nakedly. Thurzo needed something else. He needed a story. He needed an accusation so shocking, so horrifying, so far outside the bounds of noble behavior that no other noble house would lift a finger to defend her. He needed the Hungarian nobility to look at Elizabeth Bathory and see not one of their own, but a monster. And the story, as it turned out, was already growing. We do not know who first told it. 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 We do not know who first. Rumors, vague and persistent and impossible to pin down, that something was very wrong in the castles of the Black Knight's widow. The rumors reached a Lutheran minister named István Magyari. Magyari was not a man to let a rumor lie. He was a preacher of the strict sort, zealous, principled, and, by his own account, horrified by what he was hearing. Between 1602 and 1604, he complained about Elizabeth Bathory publicly, from his pulpit, and he complained about her at the court in Vienna, formally, to the emperor's ministers. He was the first person to put the rumors on the official record. He was, in a sense, the match that lit the fire. We should be fair to Magyari. He may well have believed every word he said. The rumors he heard may have had substance. Cruelty to servants was endemic in the great houses of the age, and there is no reason to assume Elizabeth Bathory's household was an exception. She may have been harsh. She may have been violent. The punishments of the age, beatings, starvation, the stocks, were brutal by our standards, and routine by hers, and a mistress, with a short temper and absolute power, could cross the line from harsh to monstrous, without any single act being, by the definitions of her time, illegal. Magyari may have been hearing the truth, or a version of it. But here is the thing about rumors in a kingdom at war. They do not travel in a vacuum. They travel through networks of interest. And in the Hungary of 1602, the networks of interest all ran, sooner or later, through Vienna. Magyari's complaints landed on the desk of a king who owed the subject of those complaints a fortune he could not repay. They landed on the desk of ministers who wanted the Báthorys broken. They were, whatever Magyari's own motives, exactly the weapon Thurzo had been waiting for. The king did not act on them immediately. He filed them. He let them sit. He let the rumors spread and grow and darken and reach the point where they could no longer be ignored, or, more precisely, reach the point where it would be politically convenient to stop ignoring them. And then, in 1610, 6 years after Nádasdy's death, 6 years after Thurzo had been entrusted with the widow's protection, the king gave the order: investigate, gather evidence, bring me a case. He gave the order to the man Nádasdy had trusted, the man who had tried to kill her cousin, the man whose son wanted her son's throne, the man who stood, personally, to gain from her ruin. The trap had been years in the building. It would take only months to spring. And the first thing Thurzo did, before he collected a single witness, before he rode to a single castle, was something that should tell you everything about how this case was going to go. He made sure the verdict was agreed before the trial began. We know this because the agreement is in the record, and the signature on it is not the king's, and it is not Thurzo's. It is the signature of a man who should have been Elizabeth's fiercest defender. It is the signature of her own son-in-law. We will get to him, but first, the witnesses. In March of 1610, Thurzo moved. He did not ride to Cachtice himself, not yet. He sent 2 men. They were notaries, professional record keepers, and their names were András Keresztúry and Moses Chiraki. Their instructions were simple. Go into the country around the Báthory estates, talk to people, take down what they say, bring me a case. By October of that year, they had taken 52 statements. By the following year, the number would pass 300. 313 witnesses, by the final count. It is the largest body of testimony ever assembled against a single woman in a European court of the period, and it is the rock on which the entire case against Elizabeth Bathory rests. So we are going to read it. Not all of it. 313 statements would take us a week. But we are going to read the shape of it, and we are going to read the testimony that mattered, and we are going to notice, carefully, what the witnesses actually said, and what they did not say, and how they were asked, and who was asking. Here is the first thing to notice. The witnesses were almost all peasants. They were villagers, tenant farmers, servants, the occasional minor official or priest, the great nobles of the region, the men of Elizabeth's own class, the men who might have known her household from the inside, the men who might have been able to confirm or deny the rumors with authority, were not called. The investigation went to the bottom of the social ladder, not the top. This is not an accident. Peasant testimony against a great magnate was, in the Hungary of 1610, worth exactly what the men collecting it wanted it to be worth. A peasant could be pressured. A peasant could be threatened. A peasant could be tortured. A nobleman could not easily, and a nobleman who had been pressured would have allies who would make trouble. Thurzo went where the evidence could be shaped. Here is the second thing to notice. The overwhelming majority of the 313 witnesses did not claim to have seen Elizabeth Bathory do anything. They reported rumor. They reported what they had heard from others. They reported that a girl in a neighboring village had a wound, and that the wound was said to have come from the Countess. They reported that a daughter had gone to the castle and had not come back, and that it was said that the Countess had killed her. The verb over and over is not "I saw." The verb is "it was said." They say, "I heard." The testimony is, in the main, a careful record of what the countryside believed, not what the countryside had witnessed. This matters. It matters because rumor, in a case like this, is not nothing. A rumor that persists for years, across dozens of villages, told independently by people who have no obvious reason to coordinate, is a signal that something happened. The question is what? And the record, read carefully, does not let you answer that question easily, because the record was assembled by men who had already decided what the answer was going to be. But let us be honest about the testimony, because dishonesty, in either direction, is what has poisoned this case for 400 years. Some of the witnesses did claim to have seen things, and some of what they claimed to have seen was not rumor. It was specific, and it was ugly, and it was not extracted under torture, and we have to look at it. There was, for instance, the girl at Ujhely, a village not far from the Báthory estates. She was being treated, in the summer of 1611, for a wound. A man named Tamas, a peasant from Bekov, 35 years old, testified that he had seen her, and that the flesh on her right hand, between the fingers, had been torn out, and the tendon destroyed. A provisor named Janos, 50 years old, and his wife Catalin, 36, testified that they had seen the same girl, and that the flesh had also been cut out between her shoulders, and that her right hand was, in their word, completely destroyed. A man named Martinus, also 50, testified that he had asked the girl, directly, who had done this to her. And the girl, according to Martinus, had answered, "The lady widow Nadezhdy, Elizabeth." That is not rumor. That is a named victim, with a named injury, identifying her attacker by name, to a witness who was prepared to repeat it on the record. We can argue about whether the girl was telling the truth. We can argue about whether the injury was inflicted by Elizabeth or by a servant in her household, or by someone else entirely, but we cannot pretend this testimony does not exist, or that it is just gossip. It is something heavier than gossip. There was the testimony of Dorothea Cachtice, one of the servants arrested with Elizabeth. Cachtice said that Elizabeth would stick needles into the fingers of the girls, and that when she did, she would say, "If it hurts the whore, she can pull it out," and that if the girl did pull the needle out, Elizabeth would cut the finger off with a knife. This is ugly testimony, and it came from a woman who was, herself, in terrible danger, and who would eventually be tortured and burned for what she was confessing to. We have to read it with that context. A confession given by a woman who knows she is about to be tortured is not worth very much, in any century. But it is not worth nothing either, and it is on the record. There was the testimony of a woman named Barbara, 25 years old, an attendant who had traveled with Elizabeth for 4 months. Barbara was questioned at Castle Carristor, and her statement was taken down by the notary Cherokee on the 14th of December 1611, on the direct orders of King Matthias. And Barbara's testimony was not given under torture. It was voluntary, and she said that she had seen, with her own eyes, girls tormented at the estate of Bitka, beaten, thrashed, cut, stabbed with needles. She said Elizabeth had ordered stinging nettles pushed into the girls' wounds, or had the girls covered in nettles, to torment them further. And Barbara said something else, something that the legend has seized on, and that the record presents more ambiguously. She said she did not know the names of all the girls, because, in general, the girls were grabbed from anywhere and brought there. Grabbed from anywhere. Read that again. The legend will turn this into a portrait of a woman who kidnapped and murdered at random, a vampire feeding on a captive population. The record presents it as a servant's confused account of a household that took in girls, hired them, accepted them as students, received them as patients, from many surrounding villages, without keeping careful track of who was who. Both readings are possible. The record does not let us choose between them with confidence. What the record does is preserve the ambiguity, and the legend, for 4 centuries, has resolved the ambiguity in the direction that makes the better story. There was the testimony of Ficzko, János Újvári, the young male servant, the one the others called Ibis. Ficzko said that they would lure girls, or outright kidnap them, from different places, and bring them to the many different castles. He corroborated Barbara's account of a household that drew girls from a wide area and did not keep careful count. He too was in danger when he spoke, and his testimony, like Dorothea's, has to be read with that in mind. And then there was the testimony that, more than any other, gives the case its human weight. The testimony of a man named János Deseo. Deseo was the castellan, the warden, of Castle Carristor. He was not a peasant, he was a minor official, a man of some standing, and he testified, voluntarily, not under torture, about his own niece. Her name was Kata Bereni. She had been accepted, as a girl of her station might be, into Elizabeth's household, to serve and to learn. Rumors reached her uncle that she was being mistreated. DC, worried, learned that his niece was about to accompany Elizabeth on a trip to Cachtice, and he rode out to intercept the traveling party. He wanted to see his niece before she left. He wanted to give her some money. He found her. He found her, he said, dejected, crying, freezing cold. The sight, he told the court, brought him to tears, and he begged Elizabeth, on his knees, in the name of God, not to take his niece away. He said, "We see that she does not know how to serve the will of your grace. Let her come home." And Elizabeth, according to Desailly, refused. She said, "I certainly will not give her back, because she has already escaped from me 3 times. All the more I will kill her. All the more I will kill her." Read that twice. This is not a rumor reported by a peasant. This is a noblewoman, accused in her own words, by a man of standing, who says he heard her threaten to kill his niece. Desailly testified that Elizabeth took Cata away, tormented her, and that the girl died. This is the hardest testimony in the entire record to explain away. It is not under torture. It is not second-hand rumor. It is a specific man with a specific name, testifying about a specific girl with a specific name and a specific conversation and a specific death. If anything in the record convinces a fair-minded reader that Elizabeth Bathory was, at minimum, cruel to the girls in her household, and possibly far worse than cruel, it is this. We have to sit with that. We cannot build a case for her innocence by pretending Desailly did not testify, or by pretending his testimony does not mean what it says. The honest reading of the record is that Elizabeth Bathory was, very probably, a harsh and sometimes violent mistress of her household, that girls in her care were hurt, that at least some of them died, and that she bore responsibility for it. The honest reading is not that she was a saint. The honest reading is that she was a woman of her class and her century, with the absolute power her rank gave her, and that she used that power in ways that, even by the standards of her own time, drew complaint. But, and this is the word that everything in this story turns on, but, the honest reading is also that the testimony, heavy as it is, does not say what the legend says it says. The testimony describes beatings, needles, nettles, cruelty, deaths. It does not describe blood-bathing. It does not describe 650 victims. It does not describe a woman killing to stay young. It does not describe vampirism. It does not describe the cellar full of tortured noble girls, that every retelling of the story, for 400 years, has put at the center of the case. The most famous parts of the most famous accusation are not in the accusation. They are nowhere in the accusation. They were added, later, by other hands, for other reasons. And the honest reading is also that the testimony was collected by a man who had already agreed, before he collected a single statement, on what the outcome of the case would be. We know this. It is in the record. The agreement was signed 3 weeks before the arrest, and the man who signed it, on Elizabeth's side, was not her enemy. He was her family. Before we read what that agreement said, we have to stand in the doorway of Cachtice Castle on the last night of the year 1610 and watch the trap close. Here is the date the legend never gives you, the 13th of December, 1610, 18 days before the end of the year, 18 days before Thurzo would ride to Cachtice and take Elizabeth into custody. On that day, the 13th of December, a formal agreement was confirmed between Thurzo and a Hungarian nobleman named Nicola VI Zrinski. The agreement concerned 2 things. The first was the imprisonment of Elizabeth Bathory. The second was the distribution of her estate. Read that again. The agreement to imprison her and the agreement to divide up her property were both confirmed 18 days before she was arrested, before a single witness had been questioned in her presence, before a single piece of evidence had been tested in any court, before she had been charged or informed or given any opportunity to answer the accusations against her. The outcome was settled, the property was settled, and the man who settled it, on Elizabeth's side, was not her enemy. Nicola Zrinski was her son-in-law. He was married to her eldest daughter Anna. He was family. And on the 13th of December, 1610, he sat down with the man who was about to destroy his mother-in-law, and they agreed, in writing, on how she would be imprisoned and how her property would be divided. Her own family had made a deal with the man who was coming for her, before the arrest, before the trial, before the verdict that was never a verdict. This is the single most damning document in the entire Báthory case, and it is the one the legend has spent 400 years ignoring. Because once you know it exists, the shape of the case changes completely. This is not an investigation that produced a verdict. This is a verdict that produced an investigation. The conclusion was agreed first. The evidence was assembled to fit. And the people who should have defended her, her own son, her own sons-in-law, the men who had the standing to challenge the king and the Palatine, had already, before a hand was laid on her, agreed to let it happen. Why? Why would a woman's own family sign away her defense before she had even been arrested? The answer is the thing the legend never tells you about, because the legend does not understand the world Elizabeth Bathory lived in. The answer is property. The answer is the crown's right of confiscation. In the Hungary of 1610, a great noblewoman, publicly convicted of a notorious crime, would lose everything. Her estate would be seized by the crown. Her children's inheritance would be gone. Her family's standing would be destroyed, not by the crime, but by the confiscation that followed it. The Báthory Nádasdy lands, the castles, the 17 villages, the Transylvanian holdings, the fortune, all of it would pass to Vienna. And the king, who owed that family a debt he could not pay, would, in the same stroke, erase the debt. So Thurzo offered the family a deal, a private arrangement, no public trial, no formal conviction, no confiscation. Elizabeth would be taken quietly, imprisoned quietly, and the estate would pass, intact, to her children. The family would keep the land. The family would keep the name. The family would keep the standing. All they had to do was sign, in advance, an agreement to her imprisonment, and accept the distribution of her property among themselves, and let the Palatine handle the rest. They signed. Her son Paul signed. Her son-in-law Zrinski signed. Her other son-in-law, Georgi Druzheth, was party to it. The men who should have fought for her, who should have demanded a trial, who should have challenged the king's right to move against a fellow magnate without due process, looked at the alternative, a public trial, a public conviction, a public confiscation, and they took the deal. They chose the land over the woman. They chose their inheritance over their mother. We will come back to this. We will come back to it, because it is the moral center of the entire story, and the legend, with its cellar and its bathtub, has walked right past it. The greatest betrayal of Elizabeth Bathory was not done by the king, and it was not done by Thurzo. It was done by her own children, and it was done for money. Now, the arrest. On New Year's Eve, 1610, the last day of the year, the 31st of December, Thurzo rode to Cachtice Castle. He did not announce himself. He arrived, with armed men, unannounced, at the door of one of the most powerful women in the kingdom, and he found her, the record tells us, at dinner, not in a cellar, not mid-torture, not covered in blood, not standing over a tub of murdered girls, at dinner, seated at her own table, in her own hall, in her own castle, eating a meal. The legend, for 400 years, has placed her in the act of torture when the authorities arrived. The record places her at supper, The legend says she was caught red-handed. The record says she was interrupted at her evening meal. This is not a small discrepancy. This is the difference between a scene and a story. The scene the legend describes, the Countess discovered mid-atrocity, dragged dripping from her cellar, is the scene that has fixed itself in the world's imagination. It is the scene that justifies everything that followed. And it is not in the record. It was invented, later, by the same hands that invented the blood-bathing. The Thurzo who actually rode to Cachtice on New Year's Eve found a woman at her dinner table and arrested her, and only then went looking for the evidence that would justify the arrest he had already made. He arrested her, and he arrested 4 of her servants, Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Yo, Katarina Benitska, and János Újvári, the one called Fichko. These 4 would become, in the months to come, the chief instruments of the case against her. Their confessions, extracted, as we shall see, by methods that make the word confession feel too clean, would be the foundation on which the entire edifice of the accusation rested. And Thurzo, on the night of the arrest, wrote a letter. He wrote it to his wife, and in it he described what he had found at the castle. He said he had found 1 dead girl, and he said he had found 1 living girl. A girl he described, in a word that should make you flinch, as prey. A prey girl. A girl who had been, in his account, preyed upon. Here is what he did not do with that living girl. He did not ask her what had happened to her. He did not take her statement. He did not call her as a witness. He did not, in any of the proceedings that followed, allow the one person who could have told him, firsthand, what had been done to her and by whom, to speak. The girl recovered. She lived. She was never called. She never testified. Her name is not in the record. Her account of her own injuries is not in the record. The single most important witness in the entire case, the one person who could have confirmed or denied the worst of the accusations from direct personal knowledge, was silenced. Not by Elizabeth, by Thurzo. Ask yourself why. If you have just arrested a woman on the charge that she tortured and killed the girls in her household, and you have in your hands a living girl who has, by your own account, been preyed upon, why would you not take that girl's testimony? Why would you not put her on the record? Why would you not let her name her attacker, in her own words, under oath? A prosecutor who believed his own case would have done exactly that. A prosecutor who wanted the truth would have done exactly that. A prosecutor who wanted only a conviction and who feared that the living girl's testimony might complicate the conviction he had already arranged, would do exactly what Thurzo did. He would make her disappear from the record. We do not know what the living girl would have said. That is the point. We are not allowed to know. The record was shaped, from the first night, by a man who decided what would be in it and what would not, and the testimony of the one victim who survived to speak was placed, deliberately, outside it. Thurzo, having made the arrest, made a declaration. He announced to the villagers and to the guests who had been at the castle that he had caught Elizabeth red-handed. The phrase is his, and the phrase is a lie, by his own record. She was arrested before the victims were presented. She was arrested before the evidence was gathered. She was arrested on the basis of an agreement signed 18 days earlier. The red-handed claim was theater. It was the story he needed to tell, in public, to make the arrest he had already arranged look like the response to a discovery. And then there is the matter of what Elizabeth herself said on the night of the raid. The record preserves a fragment. It is the only direct speech from her in the entire case, and it is strange, and we should read it carefully. According to the record, on the night of her arrest, Elizabeth sought to deflect the accusation. She named 2 reverends and a pastor. She said they were responsible for what had been found, and when one of the clergymen present, a Pastor Barosius, asked her why, if her servants were the ones committing the atrocities, she had not stopped them. She answered. She said, "I did it, because even I myself was afraid of them." Read that twice. I did it, because even I myself was afraid of them. This is not a confession of murder. This is a woman, in extremis, on the night of her arrest, trying to explain why she had not intervened to stop servants who, she was now being told, had been doing terrible things in her household. She said she was afraid of them. She said that was why she had not stopped them. Whether that was true, or whether it was the desperate excuse of a woman who knew she was being destroyed, we cannot know. What we can know is that this is the entirety of her voice in the record of her own case, a fragment, a sentence and a half, on the basis of 300 witnesses, and this fragment, she was condemned to 4 years of imprisonment and 4 centuries of infamy. She was not charged. She was not tried. She was not sentenced. Thurzo did not put her before a court. He did not allow her to face her accusers. He did not allow her to call witnesses in her defense. He did not allow her counsel. He took her, on the night of the 31st of December, 1610, from her dinner table to her own rooms, and he locked the door behind her, and the door would not open again for the rest of her life. But first, he had to deal with her servants, because the servants, unlike the mistress, were going to get a trial, a real one, with a verdict and a sentence and an execution. The trial that Elizabeth Bathory never received, her servants would receive in full, and the things that were done to those servants, to obtain the confessions that would be used to justify the arrest of their mistress, are the things we have to look at next, because the trial of the servants is where the case against Elizabeth Bathory was actually built, and it was built, as we are about to see, on the bodies of the people who served her. The trial began in January of 1611. It was held not in Budapest and not in Vienna, but at the castle of Bicha in present-day Slovakia, a Thurzo seat on Thurzo's ground, presided over by Thurzo's men. The 4 servants were brought before a panel of judges. Elizabeth was not. She was already, by then, locked in her rooms at Cachtice. She would not be present at the trial that would decide her fate. She would not hear the testimony given against her. She would not be given a chance to answer it. The case that would condemn her for 4 centuries would be built entirely in her absence. The 4 accused were Dorothea Sentis, Ilona Jo, Katarina Benecka, and János Ujvari, called Ficzko, 3 women and a boy. Ficzko was young. The records suggest he was a teenager, or not much older, a groom and errand runner in the household, the lowest of the 4. The 3 women were older, longer serving, and bore the bulk of the accusation. Before we read what was done to them, we have to say plainly what the law of the age permitted, because the law of the age permitted things that make the word confession almost unusable. In the Hungary of 1611, as in most of Europe, accused persons could be tortured to obtain their testimony. The practice was regulated, in theory. There were rules about what instruments could be used, how long they could be applied, how many sessions were permitted. But in practice, in a case of this magnitude, on a Thurzo estate, before Thurzo's judges, the rules were whatever Thurzo wanted them to be. And Thurzo wanted confessions. The 2 older women, Ilona Jo and Dorothea Sentis, were tortured. The instrument, by the accounts that survive, was the hot pincers. Their fingers were pulled, one by one, with heated iron, until they said what was required of them. The pain of this exceeds what words can carry, and should not be imagined too closely. It is enough to say that a person subjected to it will say whatever the person applying it wants to hear, and that this has been understood by honest jurists since the practice was invented. A confession extracted by the hot pincers is not evidence of guilt. It is evidence that the person applying the pincers wanted a confession. In any modern court, in any court that values truth, the testimony of Ilona Yo and Dorothea Sentes would be inadmissible. In the court of Thurzo, it was the foundation of the case. And they confessed. They confessed to beatings, to needles, to starvation, to the torment of the girls in the household. They confessed to helping their mistress torture and kill. Dorothea confessed to the needles and the cut-off fingers. Ilona confessed to luring girls and helping dispose of bodies. They confessed to everything that was put to them, because everything that was put to them was preferable to another session with the pincers. And the confessions were written down in the careful hand of the notary and entered into the record, and the record became, for 400 years, the proof that Elizabeth Bathory was a monster. Fichko, the boy, was treated differently. He was judged to be less culpable, younger, lower in the hierarchy, presumed to have acted on orders rather than initiative. His sentence was lighter. But the confessions attributed to him, too, have to be read with the circumstances of their extraction in mind. A young servant, arrested without warning, separated from his mistress, faced with the torture of the older women in the next room, asked to confirm what they had already said. Fichko would have confirmed anything. He confirmed that girls were brought from many places, that they were not always named, that some did not leave. He confirmed, in short, that the household existed and that bad things happened in it. He did not, because no one asked him to, confirm the blood bathing, the 650, or any of the details that would later make the case famous, because no one, in 1611, had invented them yet. Katerina Benecka was the fourth, and her case is instructive, because she was the one the court let live. The evidence against Katerina was the weakest. She was judged to be less culpable, less involved, perhaps younger, perhaps newer to the household. The court spared her the stake. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. And the fact that the court distinguished between the four, that it judged one less guilty than the others, that it imposed a graduated scale of punishment, tells you something important about the trial. It tells you that the court was capable of weighing evidence, of distinguishing degrees of culpability, of reaching different verdicts for different defendants. It was not a rubber stamp. It was a functioning tribunal, applying the standards of its time, reaching conclusions on the basis of what was put before it, which makes what it did not do all the more striking. The court weighed the evidence against the servants. The court did not weigh the evidence against the mistress. The court tried the servants. The court did not try the mistress. The court sentenced the servants. The court did not sentence the mistress. The court executed the servants, publicly, with full legal process. And then it turned to the woman at the center of the entire case, and it did. Nothing. No trial. No verdict. No sentence. The woman who was supposed to be the architect of all of it, the principal, the mistress whose will the servants had been executing, was not put through the process her servants were put through. She was simply left in her locked room, outside the law entirely. The sentences were carried out. Ilona Jo and Dorothea Sentes, having been tortured, were burned at the stake. The form of execution was reserved in the law of the age for the worst crimes: arson, witchcraft, the murder of a master by a servant. Burning was the death reserved for those who had crossed the most serious line. The two women were taken from the court after their confessions, and they were put to the fire. Fichko, the boy, was beheaded, a quicker death, a less dishonorable one, reflecting the court's judgment that he was less to blame, and his body was then burned. Katerina Benichka was taken away to prison. 3 executions, 1 life sentence. The servants of Elizabeth Bathory were disposed of, completely, by the spring of 1611, and the woman they had served was not, by any court, convicted of anything at all. Why? Why try the servants and not the mistress? Why execute the instruments and leave the principal alive, in a locked room, without a verdict? The answer, again, is the thing the legend does not understand. The answer is politics. The answer is property. The answer is the deal that had been signed on the 13th of December. King Matthias wanted Elizabeth publicly tried. The record tells us this. The king, once the rumors were out and the arrest was made, wanted the full spectacle, a formal trial, a formal verdict, a formal execution. He wanted the Bathory name dragged through a public court. He wanted, in all probability, the legal basis for the confiscation of her estate, which a public conviction would have provided. Thurzo talked him out of it, and the reason Thurzo gave is one of the most revealing sentences in the entire record. Thurzo told the king that a public trial of a great noblewoman would be perceived, by the Hungarian nobility, as a challenge by Vienna to the authority of the magnates over their own households and their own peasants. In plainer language, if the king could drag a Báthory into a public court and convict her, no great noble in Hungary was safe. The nobles would close ranks. They would defend her, not because they believed her innocent, but because the precedent of a public conviction would threaten all of them, and the Hungarian nobility, in 1611, was not a force even a Habsburg king could safely provoke. So Thurzo proposed the alternative: no public trial, no formal verdict, no execution. Instead, permanent incarceration, by royal decree in her own castle, a sentence that was not a sentence, handed down by a court that was not a court, on a woman who had been convicted of nothing. The deal that the family had already signed, the deal that protected the estate from confiscation, that protected the inheritance of her children, that protected the standing of her house, was honored. The king got his prisoner, Thurzo got his outcome, the family kept the land, and Elizabeth got 4 years in a locked room, without ever having been found guilty of anything by anyone. This is the legal reality of the Bathory case, and it is a reality the legend has never been able to absorb. The most famous female murderer in European history was not, in any legal sense, a murderer at all. She was not convicted. She was not sentenced. She was not executed. She was not even, in the strict sense, tried. She was imprisoned, by administrative decree, on the basis of testimony she was never allowed to answer, collected by a man who had agreed on her imprisonment before he collected it, for the benefit of a king who owed her money and a family who wanted her land. The servants were burned and beheaded. The mistress was walled up. And then, slowly, the record began to close around her. The witnesses who had testified were sent home. The confessions were filed. The castle was sealed. The woman herself was left, in a handful of rooms, in the building she had once ruled, to live out whatever years she had left. But before we follow her into those rooms, we have to deal with the one part of the record the legend has always refused to read. The one part that, more than any other, explains why the case went the way it went. The money, the king's debt, the fortune that was owed, and the fortune that was erased in the moment Elizabeth Bathory was taken. Because the trial of the servants answered the question of who would die, it did not answer the question of who would pay, and the answer to that question is the answer to almost everything else. Let us talk about the money. We have been circling it since the beginning, and we can no longer afford to. Ferenc Nadezhdy, the Black Knight of Hungary, fought the Emperor's war for 15 years. He fought it largely at his own expense. The Habsburg treasury, perpetually empty, perpetually borrowed against, ran up obligations to the magnates who kept the frontier manned. The Nadezhdy account was one of the largest. By the time Ferenc died, in January of 1604, the crown owed his estate a sum so large that it appears, in the surviving correspondence, as a recurring subject of negotiation between Vienna and the Nadezhdy family. The debt was not a triviality. It was a line item. It was the kind of obligation that treasurers worried about, that ministers discussed, that kings preferred not to be reminded of. When Ferenc died, the debt passed to his widow. Elizabeth, as regent for her son and as the manager of the estate, became the king's creditor. The king, Matthias II, was now personally and officially in debt to a woman he had every political reason to want broken. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is arithmetic. A king who owes a subject a fortune he cannot pay is a king with a motive, and the motive is not abstract. The motive is the cancellation of the debt, and the cancellation of the debt requires, in the law of the age, a legal mechanism, a forfeiture, a confiscation, an attainder that removes the creditor's standing to collect. The arrest of Elizabeth Bathory on the last day of December 1610 provided that mechanism, and the cancellation, the record shows, followed almost immediately. The debt the crown owed to the Nadezhdy estate, the debt that had been a subject of negotiation for years, was, after her arrest, written off, cancelled, struck from the books, as if it had never existed. The king, who had been unable to pay, no longer had to. The prisoner in the castle at Cachtice was no longer his creditor. She was, by the arrangement Thurzo had made with her family, a woman convicted of nothing and owing nothing and owed nothing. Hold the two facts side by side. A king owes a great noblewoman a fortune. The king's minister arranges the noblewoman's arrest on charges that are never tested in court. The king's debt to the noblewoman is erased. The noblewoman's estate is preserved, but only because her family agreed, in advance, to her imprisonment, and only because the alternative, a public conviction, would have handed the entire estate to the crown. The family kept the land. The king shed the debt. The minister settled his accounts with the Báthorys of Transylvania, and the woman paid for all of it with 4 years in a locked room. This is the transaction the legend obscures. Not a monster in a cellar, a deal, a financial settlement, dressed up as a prosecution, in which a woman's liberty was the price of a king's solvency and a family's inheritance. The blood, the bathtub, the 650 girls, all of that came later, and all of it, as we are about to see, served to make the transaction invisible. A woman murdered for money is a scandal. A woman murdered for money and remembered as a monster is a success. She had known it was coming, or something like it. In September of 1610, 3 months before the arrest, Elizabeth had drawn up a will. She left all her current and future possessions to her children. In the last month of 1610, in December, days or weeks before Thurzo arrived, She signed a formal arrangement, distributing her estates, her lands, and her possessions among her children. She was, in the language of estate management, putting her house in order. She knew. The rumors had been building for years. The investigators had been at work since March. She knew what was coming, and she arranged her affairs so that, whatever happened to her, her children would inherit. The will and the distribution agreement are the acts of a woman preparing for the end. They are also the acts that, by preserving the estate for her heirs, made the deal Thurzo was about to offer them possible. And then Thurzo came, and the deal was made, and the door closed. The legend says she was bricked up, walled into a single room, with only a slit for food and air, left in the dark. The record is more complicated, and more human, and in its way, more cruel. Thurzo, in his correspondence, wrote that she had been locked in a bricked room. But the documents from a visit by priests in July of 1614, 2 months before her death, describe a woman who was able to move, unhindered, within the castle. She was not, it seems, literally entombed. She was under house arrest, confined to her castle, confined to a portion of her rooms, watched, guarded, unable to leave, unable to correspond freely, unable to manage the estate she had run for 30 years, but not sealed in a cell. The bricked room was, at best, a partial truth. At worst, it was another embellishment, another detail that grew in the retelling, another image that served the legend better than it served the truth. Which is worse, if you think about it. A woman entombed in a single room is, at least, a woman whose suffering has a shape. A woman confined to a castle she once ruled, free to walk its halls but not to leave them, surrounded by the furniture and the portraits and the accounts of a life she no longer lived, waited on by guards who had once been her servants. That is a slower, stranger, more complete kind of punishment. She was made to live inside her own ruin. She was made to walk, every day, through the rooms where she had been mistress, and to know that she was mistress of nothing now, and that the world outside those rooms had decided what she was, and was not interested in what she had to say about it. 4 years, from the last day of December, 1610, to the 21st of August, 1614. 4 years in which the most powerful woman in Central Europe was reduced to a prisoner in her own house, dependent for her food and her fire on the men who had taken everything else from her. 4 years in which her children, who had signed the deal that put her there, did not, so far as the record shows, lift a hand to free her. 4 years in which her nephew in Transylvania, the prince who could have made her release a condition of any negotiation with Vienna, did not, so far as the record shows, do so. 4 years in which the king, whose debt she had absorbed, did not, so far as the record shows, give her a thought. We do not know much about those 4 years. The record, which was so careful to preserve the testimony of 300 witnesses against her, was not interested in preserving the texture of her imprisonment. We know she was visited by priests in July of 1614, and that they found her in the castle, able to move. We know she corresponded, in a limited way. We know she was, in the technical sense, alive. Beyond that, the woman herself, the woman who read 4 languages, who had run a fortune, who had borne 5 children, who had been the niece of a king, was, for 4 years, effectively silent. The record that had taken down every word spoken against her took down almost nothing spoken by her. She was allowed to exist. She was not allowed to speak. And then, on the evening of the 20th of August, 1614, she complained to her bodyguard that her hands were cold. It was a small thing, a human thing, an old woman, 54 years old, in a stone castle in the mountains, at the end of an August evening, feeling the cold in her fingers. The bodyguard, the record tells us, answered her. He said, "It is nothing, mistress. Just go lie down." She went to bed, and in the night, between the 20th and the 21st of August, 1614, Elizabeth Bathory died. She was found in the morning, in her bed, in the castle she had not been allowed to leave for 4 years. The record says she died in her sleep. She was 54 years old. The cause of death is not recorded. That, itself, is worth pausing on. A woman who had been the subject of the most sensational accusation in European history, a woman whose imprisonment had been ordered by a king, a woman whose case had been managed by the Palatine of Hungary himself, and the cause of her death, 4 years into her captivity, was not considered worth recording. She was old, by the standards of her century. She had been confined. She died. That was enough. No physician was called, or none whose record survives. No inquiry was held. She was simply dead, and the case was closed, and the world could move on. She was buried on the 25th of November, 1614, in the church of Cachtice, in the village over which she had once ruled. The burial did not go well. The villagers, the record tells us, raised an uproar at the prospect of the Countess being interred in their cemetery. They did not want her body in their ground. The legend was already, by then, doing its work. The rumors that had been rumors in 1610 had hardened, in 4 years, into something like a received truth, and the people who had lived under her did not want her bones near theirs. So the body was moved. It was taken, the record suggests, to Exed, her birthplace, to the Báthory family crypt. Even there it did not rest. The location of her grave, today, is unknown. The church at Cachtice has no marker. The crypt at Exed has no confirmed remains. The woman who had owned 17 villages and a dozen castles, who had been one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom, has no marked grave. She was erased, in death, as thoroughly as she had been erased in life. And then, with the woman safely dead and safely buried and safely forgotten, the legend began to grow. The legend that would, over the next century, turn a political prisoner into a vampire. The legend that would invent the bathtub and the blood and the 650 and the quest for eternal youth. The legend that would make her, forever after, the Blood Countess. The legend did not begin with the trial. The trial said nothing of blood bathing. The legend did not begin with the witnesses. The witnesses said nothing of blood bathing. The legend began, as we are about to see, more than a century later, in the imagination of a man who had never met her, and who wrote her story down, for the first time, in a book that would change everything. The trial records were sealed. The witnesses went home. The servants were dead. The woman was dead. And then, 115 years after she was walled up, a Jesuit priest sat down at a desk and picked up a pen and invented the Elizabeth Bathory the world would remember. Here is where the story you know actually begins. Not in 1560, when she was born. Not in 1610, when she was arrested. Not in 1611, when her servants were burned. The story you know begins in the year 1729, 115 years after Elizabeth Bathory died in her sleep at Cachtice. In 1729, a Jesuit scholar named Laszlo Tarozzi published a book. He called it Tragica Historia, the tragic history. It was, as far as anyone can tell, The first time the Báthory case had ever been written down, in full, as a narrative, for a reading public. The trial records had existed, in manuscript, in archives, since 1611, but no one had published them, no one had edited them, no one had turned them into a story. Tarazzi did, and in Tarazzi's story, for the first time, Elizabeth Bathory, bathed in blood, read that date again, 1729, 115 years after the woman was dead, 120 years after the witnesses had testified. The most famous detail of the most famous accusation in European history, the bathtub, the blood, the young women drained to preserve a countess's youth, appears for the first time in a book written by a man who never met her, never visited her castle, never spoke to a witness, and never read the trial transcript, because the trial transcript had not yet been published and would not be published for another 88 years. Think about what that means. Every retelling of the Báthory story, from 1729 to the present day, every book, every play, every film, every podcast, every late-night search engine rabbit hole, has, at its center, a detail that was invented from nothing, a full century after the events it describes. The detail is not in the record. The detail was not in the rumors the investigators collected. The detail was not in the confessions of the servants. The detail was not in the letter Thurzo wrote to his wife on the night of the arrest. The detail was not in anything anyone said or wrote or swore to in the entire lifetime of Elizabeth Bathory or anyone who knew her. The detail was placed by Tarazzi into the story, and the story was published, and the story was read, and the detail became, over the next 3 centuries, the story. Why did Tarazzi add it? We can only speculate. He was a Jesuit, writing in a counter-Reformation culture that had every reason to paint a Protestant noblewoman as a monster. He was writing in a Gothic, moralizing vein, in which the fall of a great sinner was a lesson in the wages of sin. He was writing, perhaps, to sell books. The blood detail is, undeniably, a better story than the truth. He may have been drawing on oral folklore that had grown up around the castle in the century since her death, folklore of the kind that accumulates around any ruined great house in any rural district. He may have been drawing on the genuine medical practice of her childhood, the blood and skull treatment for the falling sickness, distorted by a century of retelling into a vampiric ritual. We do not know. What we know is that he wrote it, and that no one before him had. The story came under question almost as soon as it could be checked. In 1765, the witness accounts, the actual depositions taken by Cachtice and Cherokee in 1610 and 1611, surfaced. They had been sitting, in manuscript, in archives, for 150 years. In 1817, they were published, for the first time, and they contained, as anyone who read them could see, no references to bloodbaths. None. Not a single witness of the 313 had mentioned it. Not a single confession of the 4 servants had mentioned it. Not the dead girl Thurzo claimed to have found. Not the living girl Thurzo refused to question. The bloodbathing was not in the record. It was in Tarazzi. And Tarazzi, it was now clear, had made it up. But the legend was already too useful to die. In 1850, a writer named John Paget published a book called Hungary and Transylvania, and in it he described, in loving detail, the supposed origins of Báthory's bloodbathing, the moment she supposedly discovered the restorative power of virgin blood, the progression from accident to ritual to obsession. Paget's account reads, on close inspection, like what it almost certainly is, a fictionalized recitation of oral history from the region, dressed up as fact. He does not cite a source. He does not reference a document. He tells the story because the story is good, and because, by 1850, the story is what people expected to hear when they heard her name. The legend had become self-sustaining. It no longer needed evidence. It only needed repetition, and it was repeated by at least 3 historians in the 18th and 19th centuries who included the blood-bathing in their accounts of the case, by the authors of Gothic novels who found in the Blood Countess a ready-made villain, by the compilers of encyclopedias and dictionaries of crime, who needed a woman for their entry on female serial killers and reached, inevitably, for the most famous one, by Bram Stoker's biographers, who would later claim, without any evidence in Stoker's surviving notes, that the Countess had inspired Dracula. The legend grew, and as it grew, it buried the record deeper. By the 20th century, the blood-bathing was no longer a story someone had added to the case. It was the case. The woman had become the legend. The legend had eaten the woman. And then there is the number, the 650. The legend says Elizabeth Bathory killed 650 girls. Some versions say 600. Some say more. The number is the second most famous thing about her, after the blood-bathing, and it is treated, in every retelling, as a settled fact. The Guinness Book of Records, in its entry on the most prolific female murderer in history, cites it. Documentaries repeat it. Podcasts intone it. 650. The worst female serial killer who ever lived. The record says something different. The record says that one of the servants, accounts vary on which one, claimed during the investigation to have seen a register kept by Elizabeth, in which the names of the victims were recorded. The servant claimed the register contained, depending on the version, between 300 and 650 names. No register was ever produced. No register was ever found. No document, in Elizabeth's handwriting or anyone else's, listing victims has ever surfaced. The number rests entirely on the word of a servant who was, depending on which servant it was, either about to be tortured or already being tortured, or hoping to avoid torture by saying whatever was wanted. A number, from a single, uncorroborated, coerced source, for which no physical evidence was ever offered. And the formal charges? The charges actually brought against Elizabeth Bathory and her servants, in the record, in 1611, 80 counts of murder, not 650, not 600, 80. 80 is a staggering number for a single accused. It is a number that by itself would make her case one of the most serious in European legal history. But it is not 650. The legend has taken a formal charge of 80 and inflated it, by a factor of 8, into a number that has no basis in the record, and that comes entirely from a coerced, unverified claim about a document that no one ever saw. Hold the two numbers side by side. 80 in the record, 650 in the legend. The gap between them, 570 invented victims, is the distance between a historical case and a fairy tale. And the legend has, for 300 years, preferred the fairy tale. Why? Why did the blood-bathing, and the 650, and the vampirism, and the eternal youth quest take hold so completely? Why did a story, with no basis in the record, become, for the entire world, the record? Because the legend served everyone. That is the uncomfortable answer, and we have to look at it squarely. The Habsburgs needed the legend, because the legend made the persecution of a great noblewoman into an act of justice rather than an act of politics. A woman who bathed in blood deserved what she got. A woman whose estate happened to cancel a royal debt was a more complicated story, and one Vienna had no interest in telling. The Catholic Church needed the legend, because the legend made a Protestant heroine into a demonstration of the corruption of the Reformed houses. A Calvinist countess, who was a vampire, was a better advertisement for Rome than a Calvinist countess who was a political prisoner. The storytellers needed the legend, because the legend was, and remains, a tremendous story. Gothic horror has few better raw materials than a beautiful noblewoman in a Carpathian castle who murdered girls for their blood. The Báthory family, finally and most cynically, needed the legend, because a madwoman in the family was less embarrassing than a political prisoner. A countess who had lost her mind was a misfortune. A countess who had been destroyed for her land and her faith and her family's politics was an accusation, and an accusation that pointed, uncomfortably, at her own children. The madwoman was easier to live with. The madwoman was what the world got. Even the modern appetite for the legend serves a purpose. We want our monsters simple. We want our female monsters especially simple, beautiful, vain, cruel, bloodthirsty, a warning about what women are really like behind the manners. A complicated woman, destroyed by a complicated web of money and theology and dynastic politics, in a case where the witnesses were coerced and the judge was biased and the verdict was arranged in advance, is not a comfortable story. It does not resolve. It does not let us feel the clean horror of a monster brought low. It asks us, instead, to hold two things in our heads at once: that a woman was very probably cruel, and that she was very probably also framed. That is harder. That takes longer. That is what the legend exists to prevent. So the legend grew, and the record gathered dust, and the woman who had actually lived, the literate, powerful, embattled, probably cruel, certainly framed woman, was buried under a vampire she had never been. But the record did not disappear. It waited. And in the late 20th century, finally, historians began to read it again. The reassessment began in the 1980s. For 3.5 centuries, the Taroxy version of the Báthory case had stood, more or less unchallenged, as the official story. The legend had been repeated so often and in so many forms that it had become, in the minds of most readers, the record. But in the late 20th century, a small number of historians, most of them Hungarian, most of them working in archives that had been sealed to outside scholars for decades, went back to the original documents. They read the witness depositions. They read Thurzó's correspondence. They read the will and the estate agreements and the letters between Vienna and the Báthory family. And what they found, in the records that the legend had spent 3 centuries burying, was a case that did not match the story. The first and most important of these reassessments came from a Hungarian historian named László Nagy. Nagy argued, in a book published in the 1980s, that the proceedings against Elizabeth Bathory were largely politically motivated. He pointed to the things we have already walked through: the king's debt, the Báthory threat to the Habsburg throne, Thurzó's conflicts of interest, the agreement signed before the arrest, the absence of a trial, the absence of a verdict, the cancellation of the debt. He placed the case in its political context and showed, in detail, that the men who brought the accusation had every reason to want the accused destroyed, and that the legal process they used was, by any honest standard, a travesty. Nagy was followed by Irma Sadecki-Kardos, who made a more specific argument about the physical evidence. She pointed out, as we have, that the great estates of the age functioned as hospitals for their districts, that the female head of household was responsible for the care of female patients, and that the sick, the injured, and the dying were therefore always present in the castle. She argued that Thurzo had misrepresented ordinary medical cases, the wounded and the ill who had been brought to the castle for treatment as custom and law required, as victims of torture. She noted that Thurzo, in his own letters, had wanted to keep the case quiet, to avoid a public trial, to handle the matter privately, a posture that fits awkwardly with a prosecutor who believes he has uncovered the crime of the century, and comfortably with a politician who is managing a delicate operation. In 2014, an American scholar named Rachel Lee Bledsaw completed a thesis at Illinois State University titled, pointedly, "No Blood in the Water: The Legal and Gender Conspiracies Against Countess Elizabeth Bathory in Historical Context." Bledsaw's thesis walked through the legal irregularities, the gendered dynamics of the accusation, the conflicts of interest, and the fabrication of the legend, and placed the case in the long history of women destroyed by legally sanctioned processes that were, in form, justice, and, in substance, its opposite. The thesis is one of the most thorough modern treatments of the case, and it concludes, firmly, that the proceedings against Elizabeth Bathory cannot be read as a straightforward prosecution of a criminal. And then, in 2024, a Cambridge academic named Dr. Anuchka Bailey took the reassessment further than anyone had taken it before. Bailey had spent 4 years, beginning in 2019, researching the case. She concluded not only that the accusations were false, but that Elizabeth Bathory had been, in effect, the opposite of what the legend described: a religious subversive, a printer and smuggler of books, a woman who had used her wealth and her castles to educate large numbers of young women, and who had been destroyed for it in what Bailey calls a 17th century witch hunt. Bailey points to details the legend has ignored: that only one body was found at the castle during the investigation, that there were repeated reports of coffins leaving the castle grounds, which she reads as evidence that the women in Bathory's household were being moved, alive, to her other properties and interests across Europe, rather than killed, that a printing press was documented at one of her castles, that after her husband's death, she spent, by Bailey's calculation, the modern equivalent of roughly £26 million on clothes purchased from Venice, a sum, Bailey argues, far in excess of any personal use and indicative of a commercial operation. Bailey's thesis is the most radical of the reassessments, and it should be read with care. Her argument that the women of the household were being smuggled out in coffins, alive, to safety is a hypothesis, not a proven fact, and it rests on a particular reading of ambiguous evidence. The mainstream of modern Bathory scholarship does not go as far as Bailey. Most historians stop shorter. Most would say what we have tried, throughout this account, to say honestly, that the case was politically compromised, that the legend is a fabrication, that the legal process was a travesty, and that the question of what Elizabeth Bathory actually did, in her castles, to the girls in her household, is one the surviving record does not let us answer with confidence in either direction. That is the honest position, and it is the one we should hold. The legend demands certainty. The legend demands that we pronounce her either a monster or a martyr. The record refuses both. The record says, instead, that she was a woman of her class and her century, with the absolute power her rank gave her, in a household on a war frontier, in a kingdom arranged to destroy her, accused by coerced witnesses, judged by a man with a motive, imprisoned without a trial, and remembered For 400 years, through a legend that was invented a century after her death by a man who never met her. The record does not let us say she was innocent. The testimony of Janos Deseo, the testimony of Barbara, the testimony of the girl at Ujhali, these are not nothing, and we dishonor the dead girls by pretending they are. The record does not let us say she was the monster of the legend. The blood bathing, the 650, the vampirism, the quest for eternal youth. These are not in the record, and we dishonor the truth by pretending they are. Both things are true at once. She was very probably cruel. She was very probably framed. The cruelty, such as it was, gave her enemies the material they needed. The framing turned the cruelty, whatever its actual extent, into a legend that bore no relation to what she had done. And the woman, the literate, powerful, embattled woman who had read 4 languages and run a fortune and borne 5 children and corresponded with kings, was buried under both, buried under the cruelty, which the record preserves in fragments, and buried under the legend, which the record does not preserve at all, because the legend was not in the record. The legend was in Taraxi, and Taraxi, 115 years after she died, made up the rest. We are nearly at the end, but before we close, there is one more thing to do. We have dismantled the legend. We have walked through the record. We have stood in the doorway of the castle on New Year's Eve, 1610, and watched the trap close. We have stood in the room where she died, on the night she complained her hands were cold. Now we have to ask the question the legend was built to prevent us from asking. The question that has been waiting, since the beginning of this account, for us to be ready to face it. Not whether she was guilty. We have answered that, as honestly as the record allows. The question is why. Not why she did what she did. We may never know that, and the legend's answer, the blood and the youth and the vanity, is a lie. The question is why the world needed her to be what the legend made her. Why the world needed the Blood Countess. Why the world, 400 years later, still needs her. That is the last thing we have to understand. Because until we understand it, the legend wins. And the woman stays buried. So why? Why did the world need the Blood Countess? Why does the world, 400 years after a woman was walled into her own castle on the strength of an arrangement signed before her arrest, still prefer the vampire to the prisoner? Why, when the record has been available for 2 centuries, when the reassessment has been underway for 40 years, when every detail of the legend has been shown to be fabrication, does the legend still win? The answer is uncomfortable, and it has less to do with Elizabeth Bathory than with us. We need the legend because the legend is simple and the truth is not. The legend gives us a monster. A monster asks nothing of us. A monster we can condemn and fear and forget. A monster does not require us to look at the systems that made her, or the men who profited from her fall, or the family that signed her away, or the king who shed a debt on the night she was taken. A monster is a closed case. A monster lets us walk away. The truth does not let us walk away. The truth says that a woman was very probably cruel to the girls in her household, in a century when cruelty to servants was endemic and largely legal, and that her enemies, a king in debt, a palatine with a grudge, a family with an inheritance to protect, took that cruelty, whatever its true extent, and used it to destroy her, and then invented a vampire to make the destruction feel like justice. The truth says that the same woman who may have hurt the girls in her care was also one of the most literate people of her generation, and a ruler of estates, and a correspondent of kings, and a mother of 5, and a prisoner for 4 years, and a woman who died complaining that her hands were cold. The truth holds all of that at once. The truth is heavy. The legend is light. And we, almost always, choose the light. We need the legend, because the legend is the shape we have learned to give to powerful women we want to be rid of. This is the harder thing to say, and we should say it anyway. A woman with power, in any century, is a problem for the people around her. A woman with land, with money, with learning, with a family name that opens doors. Such a woman is, by her existence, a challenge to the arrangements that keep power in the hands of the people who already have it. There are many ways to deal with such a woman. You can marry her off. You can widower her. You can take her to court. You can take her to a nunnery. You can take her, as the record shows Thurzo took Elizabeth, to a locked room in her own castle. And if none of that is enough, if the woman is too powerful, or too inconvenient, or simply too present, you can turn her into a monster. You can tell a story about her so terrible that no one will want to defend her. You can make her name into a warning. You can make her, in the memory of the world, something less than human, so that the things done to her stop mattering. This is not a thing that happened only to Elizabeth Bathory. This is a thing that has happened, in different forms, to powerful women in every century we have records for. The details change. The mechanism is the same. Take the woman's power. Take her name. Take her story. Replace the story with one that serves you. Wait. The woman dies. The legend lives. We need the legend, because the legend is profitable. This is the ugliest answer, and it may be the truest. The Blood Countess sells books. She sells tickets. She sells films and television series and podcasts and Halloween costumes and tourist visits to the ruin at Cachtice. She is, 400 years after her death, an industry that depends entirely on the legend being true, or at least on the legend being believed. The ruin at Cachtice does not draw visitors because a woman was imprisoned there without a trial. It draws visitors because a woman is said to have bathed in blood there. Take away the blood, and the ruin is a ruin. Take away the legend, and the industry collapses. There are people, today, whose livelihoods depend on the legend of Elizabeth Bathory being the legend. They are not going to read the reassessment. They are not going to visit the archive. They are going to keep telling the story, because the story pays. The legend has an economic interest in its own survival, and that interest is, at this point, more powerful than any document. And we need the legend, finally, because the legend lets us off the hook. If Elizabeth Bathory was a monster, then what happened to her was justice, and we do not have to think about it. If she was a monster, then the king who shed his debt was a king doing his duty. The palatine who arranged the arrest was a palatine doing his job. The family who signed the agreement was a family protecting its honor. The court that burned the servants was a court upholding the law. The legend makes everyone in this story, except the woman at the center of it, either a hero or a bystander. The truth makes them something else. The truth makes them participants in a transaction, in which a woman's liberty was the price of a king's solvency, a family's inheritance, a minister's ambitions, and a kingdom's politics. The truth asks us to look at every one of them, the king, the palatine, the son, the sons-in-law, the judges, the witnesses, the priests, the villagers who would not have her body in their cemetery, and to see, in each of them, someone who chose, actively or passively, to let it happen. That is a harder thing to look at, That is a thing most people, for 400 years, have preferred not to look at. The legend exists so that we do not have to. So, what do we do with her? With the woman, I mean. Not the legend. The legend will take care of itself. It always does. What do we do with Elizabeth Bathory? The woman who read 4 languages and ran a fortune and bore 5 children and was arrested at her dinner table on the last night of December 1610, and was never tried, and was never sentenced, and was never allowed to answer the 300 witnesses who spoke against her, and was walled into her own castle for 4 years, and died complaining that her hands were cold, and was buried in a church where the villagers did not want her, and was moved to a crypt no one can now find. We do the only thing that can be done. At this distance, for a woman the world has spent 4 centuries misunderstanding. We give her, as far as the record allows, the trial she never had. We read the testimony. We weigh the evidence. We notice the conflicts of interest. We notice the coerced confessions. We notice the agreement signed before the arrest. We notice the debt that was canceled. We notice the absence of the blood bathing, and the absence of the 650, and the absence of any verdict, and the absence of any sentence. We hold the things she probably did alongside the things that were probably done to her, and we refuse, stubbornly, to let either erase the other. We refuse the legend's demand that she be a monster. We refuse the reassessment's temptation that she be a saint. We let her be, as far as the record allows, a woman. Complicated, cruel, perhaps, framed, almost certainly, destroyed, without doubt. A woman, in a castle, in a kingdom, in a century, that did not let women like her live. That is what we can do. It is not much. It is 400 years late. It will not bring her back, and it will not give her a grave, and it will not stop the next tour bus from arriving at the ruin at Cachtice. But it is something. It is the thing the record was always asking someone to do, and that, for 400 years, almost no one was willing to do. Read it. Read it honestly. Refuse the legend. Let the woman back out from behind the wall. The ruin at Cachtice still stands. It stands on a hill in the Little Carpathians, in present-day Slovakia, a few hours' drive from Bratislava. The walls are broken. The towers are gone. The chapel is a fragment. There is no marker for her grave. There is no display in the ruin of the trial records. There is no mention on the signs of the agreement signed on the 13th of December, 1610, or of the debt that was cancelled, or of the 4 years she spent locked in the rooms above. There is, instead, the legend in the gift shop, the legend on the placards, the legend in the voices of the guides, the Blood Countess, the bathtub, the 650, the story the world knows and prefers and will not let go. Stand in the ruin if you ever go. Stand in the cold of it, in the wind off the Carpathians, in the broken rooms where a woman once lived and ruled and was imprisoned and died. And remember, standing there, that the woman who lived here was not the woman on the placards. The woman who lived here was born in the summer of 1560, on a great estate, into one of the most powerful families in Europe. She read 4 languages. She married at 14. She ran a fortune. She raised 5 children. She corresponded with kings. She was arrested on the last night of December 1610 at her own dinner table by a man her dying husband had trusted. She was never tried. She was never sentenced. She died in August of 1614, complaining that her hands were cold. She is buried somewhere under your feet, or somewhere else, no one knows. She has no marked grave. She was not the Blood Countess. She was Elizabeth Bathory. And the story you have heard tonight is the story the record tells, not the legend, the record. Read it, if you doubt any of this. It is there. It has always been there. It was waiting for someone to read it, the way a trial is supposed to be read, with the conflicts of interest noted, and the coerced testimony discounted, and the invented details struck out, and the woman at the center of it given, at last, the chance to be a person rather than a monster. She never got that chance in her life. She does not get it fully in her death. But she gets, from anyone who listens to the record instead of the legend, the only thing the dead can still be given. She gets to be known, as she was, not as the story needed her to be, a woman, behind a wall, waiting 400 years to be let out.